Monday, December 22nd, 2025, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Well, today I have a very popular guest all over YouTube, really, Alex Krainer. He's a former hedge fund manager. He's a geopolitical and economic analyst. Uh, Welcome back, Alex.
Thank you for the invite, Mario. Always good to join you.
Yeah, thank you for accepting. It's an honor to have you on the channel. Yeah, the last time we spoke was October 10th. We spoke about the shadow banking system. Precious metals at the time were running up to new highs by the middle of October. We corrected for a couple of months, and now with silver leading, it looks like we're driving towards a new higher leg. Gold is above 4,400, new all-time high. So maybe we could start with that. What you think that is signaling for the markets, for geopolitics, and the economy?
I think it's basically pretty much on tracks on what we discussed the last time. And basically, my suspicion was that we might see like a hockey stick progression in the prices of precious metals. And so far as gold and silver are concerned, this is pretty much what we're seeing. We have a trend which appears to be accelerating. Now, of course, when things like this happen, it's always a thankless task to try to predict where it might go. And the reason why I was suspecting some kind of a hockey stick progression is because I've been observing this for pretty much the last 10 years, that when some market goes into an uptrend, that it tends to gather pace and then at some point break into a practically vertical climb. It was just one thing after another. And I wondered why that is, because if you look at the last 20, 30, 40 years of price fluctuations, you generally see fairly ordinary um, fluctuations that, have their uptrends, they have their consolidations, corrections, downtrends. And so it seems almost cyclical. Now we have a different regime, it appears, and the way I explain this to myself, and there's a chance that I'm right about this, is that because of all this unprecedented money printing and quantitative easing, a lot of the liquidity ended up in the shadow banking system. So we're talking about not banks, but institutions like hedge funds, pension funds, endowments, insurance companies, and so forth. So these are institutional, financial institutions that control large amount of liquid investable assets, but they're not banks in the sense that they can't create credit. So they don't have printing presses. They cannot conjure up money out of thin air. Nevertheless, today they control something like $220 trillion in the world. And so it seems to me that what happens is that when some security or some asset becomes, um, let's call it popular, when it starts to break into a trend and it starts to gain attention of all these money managers, then it's enough for a small percentage of them to say, oh, well, maybe we should have an allocation to gold or silver, or maybe we should increase our allocation to gold and silver. And if one in 100 of them make this decision, it puts enormous pressure on the price. Because if we take the gold market, it's at current prices, let's call it between 40 and 45 trillion dollars. That's that's the complete size of the whole gold market in the world. But then if you narrow this down to the tradable gold. So let's call it futures, ETFs, and so forth. That's a tiny sliver of those 44 trillion. And so that's the size of the market that is available to those $220 trillion dollars. So I think that this is the reason why we've seen so many of these hockey stick trends. And so we are now there. We now gold has pretty much doubled this year, very close. So has silver. And I think that there's we're now, if you look at the weekly charts, they pretty much do look vertical. And when that happens, there's no telling where it might go. We've seen things like Bitcoin, stocks like Nvidia, Tesla, uh, commodities like cocoa, cobalt, palladium, about 10 years ago. They've all gone way, way, way beyond anybody thought that they might go. Anything that might be, let's call it justifiable on the basis of fundamentals and the priors, and I think that this is it's these new conditions in the market that we haven't seen before. So we're really in the uncharted territories. So, like when I hear market analysts say like, oh, this year gold price might go to $4,000, $3,600, $3,200. Like we're way, way, way past all those. And there's been so many of these analyses that they say like, oh, this year gold is going to go to $3,000 an ounce. Well, we're 4,400 plus. And who knows, maybe by the end of next year we might be at 8,000 or 20,000. I don't think it's even possible to predict this exactly because you have an enormous amount of capital, of liquid investable capital, chasing after very, very limited supply of securities. And you know, uh, it's a matter of collective psychology of the markets that at a given moment, people are afraid of missing the boat. People are afraid of missing out. So they'll just go in. They don't even ask what the price is. People were buying Bitcoin at $120,000 a couple of months ago. Of course, Bitcoin has corrected. Gold might correct, silver might correct, but we can't predict this at this point.
Yeah, yeah, I know. I agree with you. It's like I think you look at trend following, don't you? And once it breaks like a certain, let's say, 55-day or 100-day high, the markets really take off. I've noticed that recently you've spoken on other channels about the fall of the West. And I'm old enough to remember back in the 80s when the Eastern Bloc or the Soviet Bloc, Warsaw Pact, whatever you want to call it, when that collapsed. And it seemed a big surprise to those of us probably who weren't following it closely as people, let's say, like you and I, who are following been happening in the West, ever since '08. And it was a big surprise when the Warsaw Pact collapsed, the Berlin Wall fell. Many people were shocked because it seemed to happen overnight. But after it happened, people analyzed it, and we came to the conclusion that it was inevitable. So, are we in the same kind of scenario in the West? And by the West, I mean the USA, all the European NATO countries, and also Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Are we in the same boat, so to speak, as Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union were? And is that also, one of the reasons why uh, people are moving on to gold and silver because of that uncertainty?
Yes, I do think so. I think that with regards to the United States, I think it's hard to say because you know, the United States is a very big, powerful, and very robust player. So I think it's not a fragile system, and I think that it will find ways um, to regroup and to maybe engineer a soft landing and a reform that will enable it to catch up. When it comes to the vassals of the Western Empire, I think they're all very, very fragile institutions and structures. And I think that in particular here, the weak links are Japan and probably European Union in particular. And so I think with respect to the European Union, I think that we're very likely going to see an unraveling similar to that of the Soviet Union. So we're looking at a crisis festering. Uh, we're looking at the very panicked reactions of the ruling establishment and the structures of the European Union. And of course, this generates a reaction because, you can't you can't be looking to appropriate other people's assets. You can't be breaking the laws and treaties that constitute your legal foundation without there being very, very adverse consequences to the whole thing. And so now we're watching the ruling establishment of the European institutions practically starting to consume themselves. And there's no happy ending to this. You're basically eviscerating your own institutions. You're causing the member nations to question, why are we members of this bloc anymore? This seems like collective suicide. You've already had leaders like Viktor Orban beginning to announce to his own constituents in Hungary that get ready for this whole thing to come crashing down. This is not for the ages. And you see that political factions that want to reestablish, reassert national sovereignty gain power, while those who are maybe more loyal to the whole idea of European integration into a unified political bloc, they're rapidly losing support. So, if you don't pay attention, these things take you by surprise. If you do pay attention, you see that it's going off the rails and that there's going to be a moment in time when, like with the Soviet Union, you had the so-called Belaveja Accords, when the leaders of the constituent Soviet republics got together and they basically drafted a document saying, okay, Soviet Union is no longer. And so I think that we might see something similar happen uh, with the European Union. Then there's also the question of them vacating the civil rights, which were, one of the main attractions of the European Union. There was like at least an overt ostensible support for human rights, for the rule of law, civil liberty, like all these wonderful, nice things. And now we've seen the European Union crack down on that in the most shockingly harsh way by issuing sanctions against a group of 50, some 60 individuals. And, sanctions that sounds like, oh, you some, maybe you're subjected to some minor inconveniences. It's a warning or something. But it's profoundly problematic because it's issued by the thing called um, Council of the European Union. I didn't even know that existed. I thought it was the same thing as Council of Europe. Who thought that Council of European Union was a different thing than Council of Europe? And so you have here a group of unelected bureaucrats who simply put individuals of their choosing. on a list to be sanctioned. And what happens then is that your bank accounts get frozen. So basically, you become expropriated. Your credit cards are blocked. Your online access is blocked. You can no longer travel. You can no longer board a plane to go. You cannot even fly in the European Union airspace. So, it's almost like all of a sudden you get cut off from society. As one of the people who has been targeted, Natalie Young, who is Swiss Cameroonian, uh, she basically said it's a socio-economic death sentence. There's no trial. The accused is not confronted with the accusation. They're not given the opportunity to defend themselves. Basically, this Council of the European Union is the prosecutor, the judge, and the executioner all in one. And then somehow, amazingly, their decision is instantly executed. It's instantly implemented. So what that reveals is that they've created this matrix where there's basically a node which they snip off and you're done. And not only you, but imagine if you have employees, they will no longer have a job. They will no longer receive a salary. If you have dependents at home, like you have small children, you're no longer going to be able to provide for them. If your children need medical procedures or medicines, you're no longer going to be able to buy for them. If you have elderly parents, you're not going to be able to. So you're basically, this is like, I don't know, a form of inquisition. It's a medieval punishment of extreme violence and cruelty, which is nevertheless being delivered by a flick of a pen of a number of completely anonymous bureaucrats. Okay, Kaya Kallas signed off on these sanctions, but where the sanctions originate exactly, I doubt that Kaya Kallas is watching all these podcasts and deciding whom she doesn't like. There's probably some, intelligence structure is um, that is putting together these lists of to to sanction people. So what is going to be an effect of this? The effect of it is that, my own reaction is like, okay, if this is so, then my main vulnerability is the money I have in my bank account. So immediately you think, okay, I have to get into Bitcoin, I have to get into gold and silver, I have to buy physical gold and silver. That's what I have to do. I have to. And then, the next thing this is going to cause it's going to cause emergence of gray and black markets, because that's where people are going to increasingly going to resort to be able to conduct their transactions, to buy food, to buy fuel and whatnot. And, that goes in the direction of them completely losing political control, because if you have a small percentage of people participating in black markets, well, then you can crack down. But if you have a substantial percentage of your population in black markets, you completely lose control, because you can't go cracking down after millions or tens of millions of people. So you get then a situation like in Zimbabwe or Argentina or Venezuela, where practically the bulk of the nation's GDP is transacted on black market. And guess what? The governments don't collect any taxes on black market transactions. So it's a particularly dumb form of suicide that we see European Union um, doing. And then, I didn't mention the UK, but Great Britain is in a world of trouble of their own. They also may have better maneuvering space than, a patchwork of 27 member nations in European Union, but they're equally vulnerable, and so is Japan.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I
so,
mean, I was thinking about the UK when we were talking now because it seems like people in the Labour government, I think his name is Wes Streeting, he was saying that the UK should revert back and rejoin the European Union. It just seems really crazy to me. And do you think Western Europe and even the US and the UK, are we in this predicament because of uh, all the money printing and bailouts that we've had to do since '08? And then you had the Ukraine situation. I think, I don't know if you agree with me, but let me know. It was a last-ditch effort by Europe to try to change the regime in Moscow so that they could gain control through a puppet of all the resources in Russia. And now that's failed. I mean, I've seen that. I don't know why, but it looks like they've come to some kind of sense, the EU. They're not gonna like use the frozen assets. They decided to lend, I think, $90 billion. That's going to be tough getting raising that money too. So, do you think that's why we are in this predicament? We gambled trying to topple Putin, and it's failed.
I think that's largely a part of it. Well, we have to remember that we had this pandemic in 2020, so that was a massive adverse event, which kind of festered but didn't trigger the avalanche. Then we had this net zero agenda, which also added to the problems. Um, Basically, we deprived ourselves of cheap, abundant sources of energy that are essential for our industries to remain competitive and so forth. So it's like Europe cut off its own leg and pretends to want to participate in the global uh, trade. And I think that this has probably rendered the leadership of European powers all the more desperate to kind of try to make up by taking over Ukraine and Russia. And so then they bet the ranch on Ukraine, on Project Ukraine, and now they lost there too. And so their sole source of um, hope is the United States. Well, now we have a different situation there too. So it's, you know, the avalanche has started and there's no reversing it. This is going to be very, very adverse period for European powers. I think we can't exclude the certain likelihood of social uprisings. Well, we already see the social uprisings, but this could turn into civil wars or revolutions. And then I think the traditional reaction of ruling oligarchies when it comes to this point is to yell barbarians at the gate, because what they're afraid of now is a social revolt. The the segment of society that is the greatest risk to them are fighting age males. And so what you do is you invoke the danger of an external enemy, and then you send all the fighting age males to the front to fight the external enemy. So you diminish the social tensions a little bit. Uh, you distract people away from yourself to evil Russians, and then you hope to bleed the youth of the nation as much as you can. I mean, I know this sounds horribly harsh, but we can look at many wars that, they always promise us a war that's going to be quick and relatively cheap in terms of lives and resources. And then you study, why did this war drag on so long? Why did so many people get killed? In particular World War One. And you realize that it was being done on purpose. They didn't want the war to end. And in the same way, they don't want the war in Ukraine to end. They keep finding ways to extend it, to make sure that Ukraine keeps fighting. And I think that this could possibly come. Now, again, I'm going to say I'm I'm cautiously hopeful that things are going to be different this time because we 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 no longer depend on television and newspapers for our information. So it's very difficult for them to control the narrative. B, since World War II, European powers have made themselves dependent on the United States to such an extent that they now have many vulnerabilities that the American administration can exploit to force a change in policy in Europe. And if there's going to be no change in policy, then there's going to be changes of government. So, the United States has been one of the perpetrators of color revolutions around the world. So they know how to do this, and they've been active in doing this. And I think that Europe is chock full of institutions that were created for that purpose. You know, NGOs, Antifas, um, Black Lives Matters, these types of organizations, like social justice warriors. And I think it's quite possible that the American administration might actually activate all these institutions and force social revolts that will topple the governments like Emmanuel Macron's, Friedrich Merz's, Keir Starmer's, and so forth. And it may be that we're already looking at this, because we already now have um, very large protests going on in Belgium, France, Spain, Italy, Poland, and Germany. And I think they've been planned for Ireland as well. And I don't know if these are spontaneous events or whether they're in some way being directed and encouraged.
Well, yeah, that makes sense. And like you said, nowadays we don't depend as much on television and newspapers for the narrative. And to me, it seems like the general public in the EU and the UK, why would they want to fight the Russians for the kind of leaders that we have? So I don't see it happening. I see the EU and the UK more like chihuahuas barking, at a Doberman, and the Doberman being Russia and Putin. Yeah, so I think they're crazy to want a war with Russia. Russia is a lot stronger, and I'm not sure the US would come to the rescue. And talking about the US, whether they would come to the rescue, we saw recently, Alex, the new is it new security strategy paper by the US,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
they say that they're going to focus on the Western Hemisphere. Maybe you could touch upon that, and maybe also a little bit on Venezuela. What do you think is going on there?
Okay. So going back to the European war scenario, like I wouldn't be complacent because they they have no illusions about being able to defeat Russia. They know that's not the game. The game is to, basically when you tackle an external enemy, what happens on the domestic front is that the population tends to close ranks behind their leaders, even if they hate them, and then, once you have that external enemy and the hostilities take off, then opposition becomes um, opposition gets silenced because if you criticize the government you're immediately being accused of being unpatriotic or being aiding and abetting the enemy. And so it allows the governments uh, to deal with the opposition the quick and dirty way. So now you get into a war, you start sacrificing your own people on the front line. You know you're not going to win, but then the diplomacy starts working on bringing in new allies. And you know the United States didn't want to get involved in World War One, and they also did not want to get involved in World War Two, but they did anyway. And so it took a lot of diplomatic footwork by the British to kind of bring the United States on board. And it took some false flag attacks that were orchestrated. You know, we had the sinking of the Lusitania that finally brought the United States into the war. And then we also had the attack on Pearl Harbor, which brought the United States into World War II. And so this is their calculus. They think we have to get the mess going, and then we're going to finagle as we go along. And you know, Vladimir Zelensky himself uh, gave away the thinking. You know, the mindset is that, yeah, you know, things change, leaders die. So, you know, it's they're, you know, as we speak, they're probably sitting behind closed doors discussing how to get rid of Donald Trump. And then, you know, if you manage somehow to pull that off and bring Kamala Harris or somebody like Jake Sullivan or Anthony Blinken to power, then, you know, you could bring the United States on board again. I'm just saying, this is how they think, and this is their what they're going to try to do. The national security strategy document that was published, what about a week ago, 10 days ago, uh, that's a very that's a very strong document, in fact. And so it's basically breaking with the European allies. Uh, it it even mentions that the way Europeans are headed leads to civilizational erasure because they're going for authoritarianism and a tyrannical form of government. And so that's the road to perdition. And the United States intends to focus on their partnership with Russia, and they intend to focus on the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so that leaves the Europeans in the lurch. I don't know what the deal is with Venezuela. Honestly, I can't really discern it because all of the reasons that we're given for this uh, don't make a great deal of sense to me. So I don't buy the narco trafficking angle because that doesn't make much sense. You know, mm, Venezuela doesn't produce much drugs, and the main problem, the fentanyl, uh, in the United States, it doesn't come from Venezuela. Second, if you really wanted to tackle narco trafficking, your first target should be the money laundering banks. Uh, your second target probably should be Ecuador, then Canada, Mexico, and then, you know, far, far, far down the list, you might have Venezuela, but it's so, you know, this is the ostensible reason given, but it's not the truth. Um, Crude oil, I doubt that story very much as well, because that would be Donald Trump wasting the resources and lives of the American people in order to hand a gift to Wall Street. And Trump has pretty much uh, overtly decided to confront the financial oligarchy. So why would he do this just to gift them the gift of massive new collateral? That doesn't make much sense to me. And then there's also a huge risk that things go wrong. You know, if you go to war against Venezuela, it's very likely that you're going to end up in a Vietnam style quagmire. And Venezuelans are capable of sinking American carriers. So if you have a sunk ship, if you have thousands of servicemen who die, um, if the war goes something like Afghanistan, where you end up defeated by insurgents, by the local insurgencies, it's not going to help Trump win the midterm elections. So it doesn't make sense to me that he would take such reckless risk in the Caribbean for some reason that's really hard for me to discern. I think there's only downside. So I have to consider that there are unknown reasons that may have to do with um, Smartmatic and Dominion system voting machines that allegedly are being managed from Venezuela, or that they have servers in Venezuela, or something like that. That the Venezuelans got involved with the CIA, I think, with certain rogue factions of the CIA. I think there's some reasons to believe that that's possible because, what happened when the war started in 2022 in Ukraine. Uh, People from the Biden administration decided that they need to talk to the Venezuelans, presumably for access to heavy oil, because the oil from fracking is not usable for production of diesel fuel and jet fuel. So maybe they needed a reliable supply of abundant heavy oil. So they went to Caracas and they negotiated with Maduro government, and then they decided to drop some sanctions against Venezuela. And another agenda that the Biden administration were pursuing was flooding the United States with illegal immigrants. And so it seems to me that maybe Maduro there made the deal with the devil, in order to get economic relief and sanction relief, that he agreed to certain things because, there was the question of oil, but then there were other subjects that we don't know about. There was some kind of cooperation between Maduro government and the Biden administration that was agreed, but we don't know what it is. Some of those agreements remained undisclosed. So I assume that Trump may be exerting pressure on the Maduro government for the reasons of, let's say, draining the swamp at home, so that he's looking to go after these rogue elements in his own security state, and that he needs Venezuelan government to maybe deliver the receipts, whatever they know who it is, what their methods are, what their assets are, and so forth. So I would dare to make a prediction that we will probably not see a war against Venezuela, uh, and that in some way they're going to come to a certain understanding, and that it's going to serve the purpose of Trump confronting his swamp at home.
So, yeah, from what you've told me, Alex, the most important thing to keep an eye on is the collapse of the EU and the UK. Uh, and the US, of course, will not be immune, but like you said, the US is unique that it has is still very powerful, has a lot of resources and a big military. So they will it won't be easy, but it looks like they could withstand things. So yeah, you think this is I know it's hard to predict, but do you think we are on the cusp of this coming true in the coming year?
I'm very hopeful, but it's it's a hard thing because it depends on certain leaders remaining alive, like Trump, like Xi Jinping, like Vladimir Putin. And I think that the Western financial oligarchies are now desperate enough that they are discussing like, yeah, some leaders might die.
Mm.
Uh, so it's fragile, and I think that it might get derailed, but I hope that it won't. And I think that by now, because like it's not, we're not just talking about Trump. I think we're talking about a much more robust front where Trump is the front man who has uh, practically a brand name and a recognition. But I think that the opposition to globalization, to this global rules-based order, is much more broad-based. Uh, Still, if you if you manage to decapitate the movement, then it might dissipate. So I don't dare to predict, but I think that this time around, uh, the leadership in Russia, the leadership in China, in Iran, um, Belarus, and in the United States have largely wisened up to the playbook of the globalists, and that they have prepared a bit better than, let's say, Trump's first administration. And so they will definitely make themselves a very, very tough nut to crack. But how do you say it? I'm 50-50 because I don't know how else to, either things will go well or they won't. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a 50% chance. I don't know how else
No, that sounds reasonable.
make a
And
prediction.
yeah, I remember back in the late 80s when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries collapsed. I was living in Switzerland. I was ready. I was still at university or started working and talking to friends where people were already thinking of the opportunities that we could have in Eastern Europe because it was going to open up. So one thing I would say to people anywhere around the world, but also in Europe, if this comes to fruition, the collapse of the West, EU in particular, I think it will be it could be a good time as well. A lot of opportunities, like the old Chinese saying that crisis and opportunity are the same.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree, and I think that ultimately it will work out in very positive ways. And I think that we will discover a level of prosperity that we probably can't even imagine today. Because, we've been in under the current system, we've been systematically robbed of the bulk of the fruits of our labors. They've been siphoned off systematically into these global financial centers, and we got simply used to living month to month. And a couple of years ago, I think in 2022 or 23, Emmanuel Macron even came in public and made a speech about, well, we have to make peace with the fact that prosperity is over. Why should it be over? Like we are our economies today are staggeringly productive. Where is the prosperity going? Why should it be gone? I think that when we manage to reform society, we'll discover possibilities, opportunities, and prosperity like we can't probably even fathom today. And so that's all a good thing. And I think maybe this generation has the best chance at it ever because, we have this thing called internet, we have AI, we have social media, we have the ability to exchange information and knowledge and experience, mentorship, and so forth that no previous generation ever had. So I think it's a hopeful moment, and I think that we have to keep putting one foot in front of the other towards that end.
Well, that's well spoken, and it's a good way to end the year here. Uh, and I wish you and your family a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Likewise, Mario, Merry Christmas to you and all the viewers who celebrate Christmas. Best wishes for 2026, and until the next time, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.